afternoon, the submarine rose to periscope depth and began an underwater advance on St. Augustine. The captain, a man named Reinhard Hartigan, wanted to be off St. Augustine Light by dusk. He had not sunk any ships the night before, and he was anxious to sink one on this particular night. In order to get to St. Augustine, they followed the radio signal of WFOY. Now, WFOY still exists today. It's a talk radio, it's a conservative talk radio station. It was founded in 1937, and it was founded by the couple that owned the Fountain of Youth. Hence the call letters, FOY, Fountain of Youth Radio. There's a legend that along the way, as the Germans listened to the broadcasting and they loved American radio, that they were fascinated by one of the commercials, which was called the Touchton Telequiz. And the Touchton Telequiz was sponsored by Touchton Pharmacies, and it was like Name That Tune. They would play a snippet of a popular song, and if you were the first person to call in, or the first person to arrive at the Touchton store, that you would win a prize. And the song that day, according to the legend, was Boogie Woogie by the Tommy Dorsey Band. The prize was $11. It was a lot of money in those days. Tommy and Jimmy, his brother, Jimmy Dorsey, were sort of like the Beatles of their era. The Germans get to St. Augustine at around 6 p.m. in the afternoon, or 6 o'clock in the evening. And Hartigan takes the submarine, and the submarine is designated the U-123. He takes the submarine a mile off of St. Augustine Beach, and he surfaces in what is essentially still daylight. And he lets some of the crew come up on board, and so that they can look at America. And he had done this once before in New York, where he had let the crew come up and look at the lights in New York. And as some of the crew members joke, they're so close to the beach that they joke about being able to see pretty girls. So at that point, they begin moving up and down the coast, never losing sight of the St. Augustine Lighthouse. And they go as far south as Marineland and as far north as the old seaside casino at Delano Beach, which was not really a casino the way we think of casinos. It was more of a dance hall. And they begin moving further off the coast as they cruise, and they're looking for a target to sink. And as they get down to Marineland, they turn around and they head back north. Now, Marineland, and in fact the whole coast, is extremely well lit at this point. There's no blackout yet. And Marineland would have been one of the most brightly lit spots on the coast because it was the #1 tourist destination in Florida at that time. It was sort of like what Disney is today. Everyone that came to Florida went to Marineland. Many of them held the fish so that the dolphin could jump up and take it out of their hands. One of the reasons that Marineland is so popular is that it was a hangout for the rich and the famous. Marineland, one of the founders is a man named Count Ilya Tolstoy. And Count Ilya Tolstoy is the grandson of Leonid Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace. For that reason, certain famous people like to hang out there. Ernest Hemingway liked to drink at the Moby Dick Bar and Grill. The Moby Dick Bar and Grill was operated by the husband of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, who wrote The Yearling and is our area's most famous author. There's a story, and I know this one is true because I've actually seen the note, that Hemingway one night sends a note to Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. And the note says, "The gentleman would love to have a drink with you if you are, in fact, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings." And then she responds to him also by note and says, I would love to have a drink with you if you're in fact Ernest Hemingway. I'm going to pause here and talk about the video. All of this is actual footage of what I like to call our submarine. This is footage of the U-123. Most of it comes from a movie that was popular in Germany in 1941. This was a movie that was shown in the movie theaters. Average workers at the BMW plant would leave their shift, pay their 30 pfennigs, and go and watch a movie. The movie's called U-Boats Westward. And by luck, the submarine that they use in the film, in that 1941 film, is the U-123, the submarine that will come here to Florida a year later. There are also some clippings, which are interesting, and some Kriegsmarine, German Navy footage of Hartigan returning from his first mission to the United States, which was in January of 1942. So they're cruising up and down, and Hartigan is looking for a merchant ship to sink, preferably an oil tanker. Oil tankers were the #1 target for these guys. That's what they were looking for. Those were the big ships. That was where they felt they could do the most damage to American commerce and the war effort. Hartigan had sunk 2 tankers off of Brunswick, Georgia, 3 nights earlier. He sank the SS Oklahoma, which was owned by Texaco, and the SS Esso Baton Rouge, which was owned by Standard Oil New Jersey, which is now Exxon. The following night, he sank a refrigerated banana boat owned by the United Fruit Company. The name of that ship was the Esparta. And there's when I look back, there was a clip of the bananas. That's those bananas that are washing ashore in Jack's Beach come from the Esparta. Sometime around dusk, the crew spots the shadow of what they first think is 2 ships, but then determine is just one large ship headed north along the coast. That ship is the SS Gulf America. She was on her maiden voyage from Port Arthur, Texas to New York. She was laden with 90,000 barrels of kerosene, heating oil. She was the very first oil tanker to be armed with a deck gun. She had a Coast Guard escort from Miami to Cape Canaveral. The escort left them in Cape Canaveral, and she was zigzagging up the coast at about 12.5 knots. Hartigan and his men immediately pursue her. Somewhere around Ponte Vedra, the Gulf America discontinues its zigzag pattern and begins to steam due north. The commander of that was a man named Master Oscar Anderson, and it's never been proven exactly why he stopped zigzagging. But the general consensus is that he did so because he was approaching a major U.S. naval base at Mayport. And he presumed that no German in their right mind would attack a merchant ship less than 5 miles from a major U.S. naval installation. Hartigan knew better. The night before, he had piloted his submarine into the mouth of the St. John's. He had poked around inside of Mayport, and he had determined that there was nothing there that scared him. When he was done looking around in Mayport, he cruised up and down Jack's Beach, marveling at all the lights. And he had even almost run aground because he'd mistaken some of the cars driving up and down the beach for small craft. So, by the way, this pursuit from St. Augustine to Jacksonville Beach takes over 2 hours. One of the things that always shocks me is the time involved getting from one spot to another when you're at sea. So for 2 hours they're chasing him. At around 9:20 p.m., Hardigan catches up. And at this point, the SS Gulf America is 3 to 4 miles off the coast of Jacksonville Beach. Again, steaming due north. Hardigan comes in behind the Gulf America. Ideally, he wanted to come in at a right angle, the best angle to launch his torpedo attack. But he was actually coming in behind. He decides, rather than to break off the attack and go out around the St. John's Light buoy and catch up with the ship again, say off Brunswick, he decides to make a torpedo attack at a 45-degree angle. So they launch. They set their stopwatches. They begin to count down the time. They know how long it should take this torpedo to get there. The time elapses. In fact, an additional 30 seconds go by. Hardigan is cursing himself. He believes that he's wasted his second to last torpedo. Meanwhile, on the beach, there are children on the roller coaster and on the Ferris wheels. There are adults in the bars, the bathhouses, the bingo parlors, the casinos. The Jacksonville Beach Volunteer Fire Department is having its first annual Fireman's Ball. And they're dancing on the pier. Hardigan, meanwhile, is out to sea, cursing himself that he's wasted his second to last torpedo. And then there is this giant explosion. 1,500 pounds of dynamite impacting with 90,000 barrels of kerosene. A passing Eastern Airlines flight, just a regular commercial flight, going from Miami to New York, reports that the flames leap 500 feet into the air. Well, that was quick. The explosion can be heard as far away as St. Augustine and St. Mary's. The fire, the flames, can be seen as far away as Cape Canaveral in Brunswick, Georgia. On the beach, thousands of people run around screaming in horror. At first, they're not sure what's happened. In fact, some people think it might have just been a collision at sea. But then what Hardigan does next is what makes this event so unique in the annals of history. And we'll talk about the reasons in a moment, but for whatever reason, he now pilots his submarine around the stern of the Gulf America and places it between the burning ship and the shore. So that everyone on the shore, and again, it's thousands of people, can see the outline, the silhouette of this German submarine. And he then begins to open fire with his deck gun. And again, as people watch from the shore, he fires 12 shells from his 10.5 centimeter deck gun into the hull of the Gulf America. At the same time, his machine gun crew opens up and begins to shoot down the antennas so that the Gulf America cannot send a distress signal. "19 people die in the conflagration. There were 54 men on board, 19 of them died, most of them burned to death in the oil-covered ocean. Now, when Hardigan comes here in 1990 and 1992, he tells the crowd that he, in fact, pilots his submarine to the landward side because he's afraid that if he opens up with his deck gun from the seaside, that he might possibly overshoot the Gulf America and wound some of the innocent bystanders on the beach. And that's generally the accepted story. Other possibilities include the fact that the wind was blowing out to sea that night and that he was safer from the flames on the landward side. Additionally, the ship was listing to starboard, which meant that when he got to the landward side, he was able to fire into the hull. I personally think that he did this because he wanted to put on a fantastic display. that he was trying to get himself promoted, which is what happens. He was trying to get himself some awards, which also happens. In his logbook that night, he says, "We put on quite a display for the tourists. Naval gunfire, burning oil tankers, enemy submarines, things not seen every day in America." And he goes on to add that it was all at the expense of Roosevelt. Having sunk the ship, Hartigan now moves south. And I want to point out that since about 6 p.m., he's been on the surface, and he's been on the surface the entire time. And for the most part, other than when he fires his torpedo, nobody knew he was there. He begins steaming south. At the same time, because he had sunk the 2 oil tankers off Brunswick, Georgia, the Navy had dispensed a destroyer from Miami, and it sent it north. That destroyer was the Dahlgren. So as Hartigan is moving south, his crew suddenly realizes, the radio man realizes, that a fishing boat is broadcasting a distress signal. And they're essentially saying, there's a submarine, and there's a submarine right here, right next to us. And it's giving out the location coordinates, and this crew suddenly realizes that this fishing boat is talking about them. At that same time, the Dahlgren, coming out of Miami, bears down on the Gulf of America. Hartigan crash dives. He says it was the hardest crash dive of his career, and puts the submarine on the bottom in 40 feet of water. The Dahlgren passes over him and launches an array of depth charges. If you've ever seen a submarine movie, it would have looked pretty much like all those submarine movies. The boat would have shook, valves would have burst, water would have started shooting out of the pipes. For some reason, the batteries die. The batteries always die in the movies. Apparently that's real because they died that night on Hartigan. And he also has his drive shaft for one of his propellers is bent. They're only in 40 feet of water. This is not deep enough to avoid depth charges. Hartigan thinks he's done for. And he decides that he's going to abandon ship. And that's a process where he would pass out a gas mask with oxygen in a glass bottle to each member of the crew. They would have opened the hatches, flooded the ship, destroyed the secret codes, and floated to the surface. Hartigan goes, sets it all up, and he goes climbing up the conning tower. He opens the hatch. Cold water splashes him in the face, and he instinctively closes it again. He's scared. The cold water shocks him. He goes, he opens it a second time. Again, the cold water splashes his face. Again, he yanks the hatch down. And he decides in that moment that he wants to save his ship, that he's not going to abandon it. And at the same time, the Dahlgren begins to move off. The Germans think that they fooled the Americans, that the oil slick that they'd set up and the bubbles had convinced the American destroyer that the submarine was dead. The Dahlgren records indicate that they weren't really sure whether there was a submarine there at all. We were pretty unprepared for war. Hartigan counts himself lucky because he says in his log, had it been a British destroyer as opposed to American, that destroyer would have stayed on top of him for 36 hours, dropping depth charge after depth charge until he was dead. The Dahlgren moves off, Hartigan surfaces. They are able to effect repairs, including recharging the battery and straightening the crankshaft on the propeller, enough that they could get underway. They go back on the bottom, they rest. The next night, he's off Cape Canaveral. And he has one torpedo left. And off Cape Canaveral, he sinks 2 more merchant ships. He takes the first with his torpedo,